Welcome back to Amaranth Bay, everyone. The last episode, we built this road network, and today we're going to build up the area along Main Street into a cozy little Midwestern downtown. I decided to start off by building something sort of like this hotel, which is going to serve as the town's main skyscraper, I guess. It's really more of a mid-rise, but whatever. The rest of the block is going to be an important attraction in the town as well. So you have this really nice corner building over here, and then in between you have a few shorter low-rise buildings, including this Art Deco one, which is something that I really wanted to include, and I'm going to turn it into a theater, which is something that you find relatively commonly in towns like this. I couldn't find the sort of theater that was exactly how I wanted on the workshop, so I custom made it using this building, I think inspired by one in Miami, and I just had to hem in the awnings a little bit because I don't think it's meant to be wall-to-wall in this sort of context. And then I also stretched it up just a little bit to make it look a bit more impressive and kind of theater-like. Of course, I also attached this fantastic marquee as well to finish it off and really sell it. For this video, I'm generally going to go block by block instead of working kind of by theme, because I've found that it's quite a bit easier to keep the details consistent with the buildings that I've placed down, because I can kind of keep everything about the building placement and the logic of how like access and parking and everything is going to work. I can keep that in my short-term memory instead of doing it like I did with the Amaranth downtown build a long time ago in the series, where I did the skyline first and then filled in with some other buildings, and then I came back and did all the detailing. And that was just a little bit more difficult than doing it this way. And it's also just more fun to do it this way, I think. Anyway, for this block, that kind of detailing is going to be very simple. Just a few cars parked around back of the smaller buildings, and there really isn't much room to do anything else around here. But the other half of the block is going to be taken up by, or mostly taken up by, a parking lot, which I'm thinking would probably be for the hotel. So at some point in between the heyday of this downtown when it was more dense and the current day where it's a bit more car-centric and there are many empty lots, the hotel would have bought up this portion of the block and turned it into a parking lot. That sort of layout seems to be fairly common in Superior, where you have a dense area right along Tower Avenue, and then the rear part of the block has lots and lots of parking lots. But there are also a few buildings mixed in as well. So in this case, you have this nice old brick corner building that's still standing despite the onslaught of parking spots. Another thing you have in this block is a crash, so that's fun. Once again, it seemed that doing like really weird fiddly things with networks, with these like short segments and adding things and deleting things quickly, it just seems to not play nicely with the stability of the game. So for this build, I'm generally going to avoid making these kind of cramped little parking lots with networks, and we're mostly going to stick using either pre-made buildings or making them by hand with some props and decals or functional parking lot buildings on top of that. So that's generally going to give us more flexibility anyway, because dealing with networks in these small little blocks can be pretty limiting. Another building that I wanted to steal from Superior was this more modern hotel, which is kind of interesting in that it disrupts the grid, stopping this road from connecting with Main Street, or Tower Avenue in Superior. I assume this was done for some sort of traffic management reason, but no matter what the purpose of it is, I couldn't help but to include this. I used this hotel asset, which is kind of eerily similar to the one in real life, which I feel like says a lot about modern architecture, but I'm not going to get too much into that. Anyway, at the real hotel, there seems to be an attached restaurant that has a patio out along Tower Avenue, which I think is kind of a nice little thing to include, so I decided to more or less copy it here, and also do a little landscaping to blend the hotel into the environment while I was at it. course, the parking lot. For much of the downtown, I wanted these backlots to look older and more worn down because I imagine that many of them would just be built directly on top of old abandoned lots without too much resurfacing. But when you have developments like this hotel and a couple others that we're going to build later as well, you do get these brand new jet black lots where you can still probably smell the fresh asphalt. But having that kind of variation, I think, is going to create a more interesting patchwork of lots when you view it from above, which I think is important when you're building this kind of town, because if you just use the default asphalt and pavement textures, it's going to look too homogeneous from a distance, especially when such a large proportion of the physical space of the town is made up of parking lots and empty lots. Oh boy. In Duluth, the buildings downtown seem to be a bit more consistent in depth, so most of them reach all the way back from the front street, whatever street they're on, back to the alley, which in-game would be 4 tiles. In Superior, there seems to be a bit more variation, where you get some 4-tile buildings, some 2-tile buildings, and anywhere in between, really. I found that it's actually easier to build this way because all the assets that I'm using tend to have different lengths, so I didn't have to turn so many of them into POs to adjust their lengths to conform to one another, although sometimes I did end up doing that anyway, just if I wanted a different length for a particular reason. Building this way, I found that I ended up with a lot more interesting nooks and crannies along the alleys, which can be a bit fun to detail, up to a point. I tried to have each building seem like it owned the attached lot, so sometimes even when you have these big lots that span multiple buildings, they're still split into different arrangements and different kinds of uses for each business. So like in this case, you have a parking lot that's kind of in one orientation for one building, and then a parking lot that has a different orientation for the other building. For the back half of the block over here, in addition to just having parking lots and the occasional building, I also wanted to show that the town is maybe not quite as bustling as you might think if you were to just walk down Main Street. So in this case, you have this empty gravel lot alongside a couple of those storefronts. One of them is active and one of them is shuttered. So I turned that into a PO, both to expand it back a little bit, but also it stops the business from functioning. So it's realistic. There's also some sort of parking lot over here. I usually try to have some kind of ownership in mind, like I said before, so it would either be attached to a nearby business or it would be a public parking lot. But sometimes I just wanted to place down a parking lot without worrying too much about ownership or functionality. So that's the case here. I don't really know what the origin or purpose of this parking lot is here, but sometimes these things seem to just spring into existence in real life anyway. To give the build a bit of containment for this episode, I wanted the main blocks of density to be isolated to a 6-block region. So you have the historic hotel at the center on one side of Main Street and the modern hotel at the center on the other side, and then a dense block on either side of each of those. Of course, I'm using the term dense a little bit loosely here, especially compared to downtown Amaranth, which I wanted to greatly increase the density compared to real life. But I do think that having these wall-to-wall, usually historic buildings without too many empty lots is going to count as dense for our purposes here. So if the build looks a little too dense and kind of big city-like so far, at least for a small town, that's the reasoning there. I mean, Superior isn't even that small of a town in real life. I think there's like 20 to 30,000 people, something like that. And it's also within the metropolitan area of Duluth, so I think that it's pretty much getting a reasonable amount of density compared to the sprawling residential areas that we'll eventually add in the future. I used to think that it didn't really look good to vary the widths of the faces of the buildings too much. So like here you have a couple of 1-width buildings mixed in with some 2-width buildings. But the more I'm looking at that in real life, the more I'm seeing this kind of thing happen, and the more I look at it in game, I just think it looks good. So I'm going to continue to do that throughout the downtown build and not worry too much about conformity. Also, when you have these multi-story buildings that look like they'd have apartments up top, I clipped in a high-density residential block into one of the buildings just to represent that sort of mixed-use development for the entire block. So that's basically just a really easy way to bring in that mixed-use functionality that you naturally get with these old sorts of buildings that would have housing built on top of the storefront or whatever is down below. Looking back to Superior for some more inspiration here, you can see that they have another street that is cut off from Tower Avenue, and in this case they've added a little central parking island thing, which I think is kind of neat, I guess. So I'm going to build that, and to do that I'm going to use these wide roads so that we can have enough room in the center for the angled parking spots while still having a driving lane on either side. The only angled parking spot assets I had were meant to be put on the outside curb of a road, and of course when you have it in the middle you need a mirrored version, so I didn't have that in my collection, so instead I just custom made it in IMT using these line decals. It's a bit more effort than just plopping down some assets, but it does allow for a little bit more customization, so I can line them up here and then fit in these little brick islands along the outside, which I think is going to help tie it into the development of Main Street as a whole. If you'll remember, we had the brick decals in the median, so I'm thinking at the same time they would have cut off this road from Main Street and had the same style of development here. Because these parking spots are just decorative, I had to add in a few parked car props manually, and for good measure I also added in a few of these invisible parking buildings so that you can at least get a little bit of dynamic parking here. In the block next to that road, this is going to be pretty much the southeastern extent of the density, and you have pretty much a nondescript block here. I say nondescript, but we do have this building over to the right called Bill's Balls, which I think is maybe not nondescript. I also somehow placed like 4 copies of this building down at once. I don't know how that happened, but that was fun. And the rest of the block is actually pretty nondescript because it's basically just empty storefronts and parking lots. You're starting to see a pattern here. The very last block of density is going to be this northwestern one, which is going to be a bit different because it actually isn't going to be that dense, but I think it's going to speak to some of the different contrasts that I've tried to include so far in this build. I thought that this intersection would be a good candidate to have a successful business because it's right next to the rest of the density and the modern hotel and all that. So we're going to have a modern bank that is going to take up this entire portion of the block. I'm even going to trim off the alley here to make room for their parking lot. So they have this storefront that would almost fit into the wall-to-wall style if there were actually any other buildings nearby, and the remainder of the property is going to be this big parking lot. I also fleshed out the rest of the block with an abandoned building, which is that gray one that I placed down, and there's a functional funeral home over here as well. I feel like there's a bit of a metaphor somewhere in there, but I can't quite grasp it at the moment. So I'll just build that parking lot and let you think about that. In between that and the bank's parking lot, you have an empty lot. I used this giant grass decal and fit it to the lot shape with PO, which was one of the techniques that I landed on that I really liked when I was building the industrial zone a few episodes ago. So I wanted to make use of that here, and we'll use it a few other times as well later on. Before getting to the less dense areas of downtown, I did actually want to add in one more touch of density. I thought that the main hotel needed a little something extra to balance it out in our tiny little skyline. So over here along Main Street, closer to the streetcar line and the main rail line, I added in this lovely corner building, which I believe is a hotel from Denver. I figured that this would have been built in this spot because of the proximity to the passenger station just a couple blocks away, which I do plan to build in a future video and make it functional to some extent, hopefully. And because it's such a nice building and would be historically significant for the people who live here, it would have escaped from being turned into a parking lot like so many other buildings in this town. Because I figured that this would still be an active hotel, I thought it would be fun to add a modern development next to it that could serve some of the patrons there. So we have this little store, which I basically made up from a convenience store building because it just kind of weirdly fit into this spot nicely. And I added in some fictional branding, which I do realize is the same brand that I used for the local brewery back in the brewery build. But I didn't really have any other fictional signs that seemed like they could fit into this sort of supermarket type of building. It's a little bit weird of a build, but I kind of like how it turned out, actually. So hopefully all of that rambling gave you some idea of what I was going for and the different techniques that I used in pursuit of that goal, because now I'm going to shut up, speed things up, and put on some music. So with the primary development along Main Street completed, I wanted to add in a few more modern builds that are going to bring a bit of character to the downtown, hopefully. First, we have this thing in Superior, which definitely intrigued me when I first saw this. I guess it's some sort of tower that was once used for wireless phone connections or something like that. That was back in the day, long before everyone had that in their pocket, or pretty much everyone. Unfortunately, I couldn't find anything so amazingly retro on the workshop that quite fit the bill. Although, I suppose that I'm only human, so maybe I just missed something. But I thought that having some sort of communications tower here would bring a little bit of color to the downtown. So I just used this more modern looking one and added a little unit next to it that kind of resembles the building in real life. I wanted to add in a couple of more modern developments at the edge of downtown that I think kind of show that to some degree, it's a pit stop as much as a destination for people. And basically that just means that this area along the highway, kind of the 2-lane rural highway that goes through the middle of the town, some of these empty lots have been transformed into more modern services for people who might be passing through. So we'll have a truck stop of sorts in a moment to kind of distill that down to its essence. But first I wanted to build this bank with a massive parking lot. This was actually my third attempt at building this bank because I tried to make a big network-based parking lot, but it got extremely complicated because of the limited space here and kind of the shape of the building with the bank drive-through. I just ended up crashing the game basically every single time that I tried to do it that way. So that was fun. But I don't have any footage of that because I got really mad and deleted all of it. So here you're just seeing the basic prop-based version without any of the cool drive-through functionality that I was planning to get. But yeah, that's my little bank anecdote. Across the street from the bank is a big Quick Trip gas station, which is not to be confused with Quick Trip. Very different, I'm sure. There was no Quick Trip on the workshop, so I had to use Quick Trip instead. Sorry. So basically, it's just your standard gas station and convenience store with an extra little truck fueling thing as well that has a little bit more room to accommodate trucks. There's not a lot to say about this thing. I just tried to make the logic of the traffic flow kind of reflect in the lot shape. So you have a little road with these nice sweeping curbs for the truck drivers as they pull out of the truck fueling thing. And then, of course, you have the normal, more cramped area for drivers in smaller cars. There's also a little delivery area around back, which I think is kind of cool because it's right next to the main rail line. I think in this sort of environment, there's usually not too much of a barrier between the deadly rail track and any nearby meat sacks who happen to be working the delivery area. So I think that's kind of an interesting detail that you actually lack the normal sorts of barriers and stuff that you'd see here. And people just know not to walk onto the tracks, I guess. Or maybe they don't know and just no one does anything about it. Anyway, I wanted to finish off this build by updating the pricing on the sign here just to add a little bit of realism. Across Main Street from the Quick Trip, not to be confused with Quick Trip, there's a bit of an assortment of shops. First, there's this little taco place. It's sort of addressing the same customer base as the bank and the gas station, although in a slightly different package, obviously. This thing is modeled off a Hero Place in a similar location in Superior, so I thought that having some kind of vaguely angled restaurant would fit in nicely here against this kind of weird back alley that kind of accesses the main rail line. Next to that, there are just a couple of older buildings, much like the ones that make up the rest of downtown, with just a couple of random details. So this is a funny little thing I found on the workshop that I just had to include here, which is a restaurant called Pal's Sudden Service, which is apparently a real chain that you can actually go to. I thought it was made up when I downloaded this, but I guess it's real. So instead of the usual big paved parking lot, they're going to have bought up the majority of the block here, except for the one building on the corner, and they just have a big gravel lot. So I guess they're so popular that they don't actually need to invest in convenient parking because they're just going to have a constant stream of customers no matter what. But I was really happy with how this little block turned out, so even if it doesn't make sense, I'm going to keep it here. I didn't want to leave these empty before calling it quits for the day, so I quickly built up some of the standard lower density blocks like we've already done, and then the rest is going to be based on some of the industrial fringes that you see around Superior. The first block here consists of this fairly modern looking warehouse development. So you have 4 of these warehouses right next to each other in this kind of cramped area. Of course, I had to turn these big warehouse buildings into POs to get them to the right length. So after doing a little bit of detailing, adding in some parking along the facades of the building, I'm going to restore that functionality by clipping in some industrial blocks. In the next block over, there's another bit right out of Superior, which is this little building surrounded by trailers. I don't know if this is like trailer sales or rental or repair or whatever, but I thought that this kind of thing really lets you know when you look at it from a distance that this is an industrial part of town, even if it's right next to the kind of standard downtown development. So even though we have all this industrial stuff, it's not a totally industrial area, and it hasn't always been that way historically. So you do have a remnant block of houses right next to the trailer area. This is something you see a little bit of in Superior, where you have some historic looking houses intermixed with all these more modern developments right around the downtown area. It seems like many of the lots have been abandoned, and the remaining ones have been absorbed by their neighbors, so they now have bigger yards or a parking area or something like that. I have to say, like, even if these wouldn't be the most desirable places to live, you could kind of see the appeal because you're right next to downtown in a historic house within walking distance of all this fun stuff, including Bill's Balls, I guess, and the streetcar line, of course, as well. So you could hop on that, and if you wanted to do something that wasn't available nearby within walking distance, you could go to Amaranth and make use of all the services over there. Of course, this is hardly the extent of the historic houses that you're going to find in downtown. I'm sure we're going to get deeper into that in the next video. To finish off today's build, I wanted to take one more bit of inspiration from Superior, and that is this scrapyard. This seems to be a sort of like kind of metal recycling thing, so you could bring in your old metal crap and get paid a small amount for that, and they would ship it off somewhere to be turned into something new, which is kind of cool. This was a little bit of a tough build because most of the piles of metal that you see in this sort of place are actually really interesting, and each one has like a unique kind of terrifying silhouette to it, because you just get all these like pointy metal bits sticking out, and they're piled high into these like really tall piles. So I didn't really have any assets quite like that, so I tried a bunch of different ones to make these various piles. My favorites were actually these vanilla ones that I think are meant to be just like kind of random piles of junk that aren't intended to be metal necessarily, but they have these really sharp metallic edges to them that I think will work well in this context. But in addition to those, I also used some other assets for piles as well, maybe to make it look like they're very roughly sorted into different stages of processing or different types of metal or something like that. I tried to get some more variation with these by clipping in a variety of different assets like some beams. I rotated a few of these with PO to give it less of a 90-degree look, because we don't really want perpendicular things in this city, other than the grid. Anyway, there are some other interesting things scattered around here. So we have this car crusher thing, a few cars that have yet to be crushed, I suppose, and this is probably a bit of a stretch here, but I also used this Dutch bridge asset, which I thought would be kind of funny. Like someone just randomly had a Dutch bridge in their backyard and they didn't know what to do with it, so they brought it here. I did size it down a little bit just so it looks a little bit less absurd. To cap off this build, I'm going to add in the thing that originally motivated me to do this, which is this little rail spur where they seem to bring in or maybe ship out metal via rail in these gondola cars. So we have some of those cars lined up along here. One of them is empty and the other ones are full. So we have this excavator here that is in the middle of doing that process. And with that, we are done with the main downtown area. Except I forgot to add in the streetcar line, which is kind of important given that I mentioned it multiple times throughout this video as kind of motivating some of these different developments. So I didn't have an exact idea of where I wanted the stops to be for this line yet, because we haven't really built out the rest of the downtown area yet. It'll probably be something like the historic lines in Superior. So they had a loop going through the downtown, which we already have the track laid out for, but then there were also some spurs going off into different neighborhoods. So we might do something like that, or we might just leave it as this loop. But for now, I'm just going to add in the loop and connect it up to the downtown. I'm just going to call this the New Town line, which is very creative We're going to add in both the modern streetcars and one of the vintage ones as well, so we can have that old heritage car going around downtown in the cinematics, which I think should be pretty fun. I hope that you enjoyed the start of this new town. I know for me, it almost kind of felt like starting a new series, but with the caveat that we can always return to Amaranth proper for some builds in the future, which I'm sure we're going to do at some point soon. Thank you to my fantastic channel members, with a special shout out to my $5 tier members, Juki, New, Peter J, and Victor Sellon. And of course, thank you for watching. See ya. Asphalt.